Moving day had always been something I looked forward to: new beginnings, fresh paint smells, and the thrill of imagining where every piece of furniture would fit. My new home wasn't a mansion, but it was mine, tucked neatly at the end of a quiet street with a wide driveway and a backyard big enough for barbecues, a garden, and maybe even a fire pit someday. I had done my research before purchasing it, checking the paperwork twice to confirm that it wasn't part of the nearby homeowners association. That was a huge selling point for me. I had heard enough horror stories about overbearing HOA boards and their endless nitpicking to know I didn't want any part of it. The irony, of course, was that I didn't realize just how soon I would meet the living, breathing embodiment of every HOA nightmare I'd ever heard about. The morning was bright, the air filled with the scent of freshly cut grass and the muffled sounds of movers hauling boxes from the truck. I was standing by the garage, clipboard in hand, trying to keep track of what went where. Everything was running smoothly until I heard the sharp, unmistakable sound of heels clacking against the pavement. I turned and saw her for the first time, a middle-aged woman marching toward me with the confidence of a general heading into battle. She was dressed in a crisp blouse tucked into beige slacks, her hair pulled back so tightly it almost looked painful. Her expression was even tighter. Without so much as a hello, she planted herself at the edge of my driveway, crossed her arms, and declared, "You can't park that moving truck here. It's blocking the street and violates community rules." I blinked at her, caught off guard. "Good morning to you, too," I said, trying to keep my tone light. "The truck is in my driveway. It's not blocking traffic." Her eyes narrowed. That may be true, but all moving vehicles must be pre-approved by the HOA, and you clearly didn't file the paperwork. I'm the president, and I wasn't notified. I set my clipboard down, already feeling the irritation bubbling beneath my skin. "I think there's been a misunderstanding. This property isn't part of the HOA. I checked before I bought the house." The words landed like a slap. Her mouth fell open, and her face flushed crimson, but she quickly recovered with an indignant sniff. "Every house in this neighborhood falls under our jurisdiction. It's what keeps things orderly, beautiful, and valuable." I shook my head. "Not this one. The seller and my realtor confirmed it. My deed says so. I'm not in your HOA." Her jaw tightened, and she jabbed a manicured finger in the direction of my house. "You can't just opt out. That's not how it works." Before I could respond, one of the movers carrying a heavy box brushed past her, muttering under his breath about crazy neighborhood ladies. She gasped as though he had personally insulted her, and she whipped back around to me. "This is highly irregular. I demand you stop unloading until we get this sorted out." I let out a laugh I couldn't suppress. "With all due respect, I'm not stopping anything. I bought this house fair and square, and I don't answer to the HOA. If you don't like it, that's your problem, not mine." Her nostrils flared. She looked like a tea kettle about to whistle. "Do you have any idea what happens when people start thinking they're above the rules? We'll have chaos. Mailboxes painted every color of the rainbow, lawns overgrown, cars on blocks in driveways. This community will fall apart." I tilted my head, studying her. "All because I parked a moving truck in my own driveway? That seems like a stretch." That did it. She launched into a tirade about the importance of uniformity, rattling off a list of bizarre rules. Grass must be no longer than 2 inches, shutters could only be 3 approved shades of green, garden gnomes were strictly prohibited, and all holiday decorations must be removed within 48 hours of the holiday's end. I listened for a moment, equal parts amused and horrified, before finally holding up a hand to cut her off. "Look," I said firmly, "you can recite your rulebook all day, but it doesn't apply to me. My house isn't under your HOA. End of story." That was when the real meltdown began. She stomped one foot on the pavement like an angry toddler, her voice rising so loud that a couple of neighbors peeked out from behind their curtains. "I will not allow this. You will follow our rules, or you will not live here." I stood there in stunned silence for a moment, marveling at the audacity. This woman, this complete stranger, was actually telling me I couldn't live in the home I had just purchased. I glanced at the movers, who were now openly watching the spectacle with smirks plastered on their faces. One of them whispered to the other, "Bet she's fun at parties." I took a slow breath, forcing myself to stay calm. "I think we're done here. I'm moving in, whether you like it or not. If you keep harassing me, I'll have no choice but to call the police." Her eyes widened, then narrowed again into slits. "Harassment? Don't you dare accuse me of harassment. I'm protecting this neighborhood." "From what?" I shot back. "Cardboard boxes and furniture?" That got a few chuckles from the movers and even one of the neighbors who had stepped outside to watch. She didn't appreciate being laughed at. Her cheeks burned red, and she spun on her heel, muttering under her breath about outsiders and ruining everything. As she stormed back across the street, I finally exhaled, shaking my head. I had expected a few bumps in the road during the moving process, maybe a broken lamp or a misplaced box, but I never imagined I'd have to deal with a full-on HOA dictator who had no authority over me. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had specifically chosen this house to avoid exactly this kind of nonsense, and yet, on the very first day, I was dragged into a battle I didn't ask for. The rest of the day carried on with a strange kind of tension in the air. Every time I carried a box inside, I caught glimpses of her peeking through her blinds like a watchdog ready to pounce. I wondered if she was writing notes or drafting letters she'd never have the legal right to send. It was equal parts annoying and comical. Still, as I unpacked and began to settle in, I couldn't help but smile. If this was the worst she could throw at me, I knew I'd be fine. After all, I had something more powerful than any HOA rulebook, the law on my side. The days following my move-in felt less like the peaceful beginning I had envisioned, and more like I had stepped onto the stage of an ongoing neighborhood soap opera with the HOA president, whom I had mentally nicknamed Karen, playing the self-appointed villain. At first, I thought she'd blow off steam, realize she had no power over me, and retreat to her house to stew in silence. I was wrong. If anything, my polite refusal to bow to her demands seemed to light a fire under her, and she doubled down on her campaign to intimidate me. It started small, with pieces of paper taped to my mailbox. The first note was written in neat cursive on HOA letterhead and declared, "Notice of noncompliance. Your lawn must be mowed immediately." I laughed out loud when I read it, standing there with the grass barely 3 inches high. My movers had barely finished unloading boxes. I hadn't even had time to set up my bed properly, and she was already scrutinizing my yard with a measuring stick in hand, it seemed. I crumpled the note and tossed it in the recycling bin. The next day, there was another letter, this one more aggressive. "Failure to comply with HOA standards will result in fines of $100 per day." Fines against someone who wasn't even in her HOA. The audacity was almost impressive. I decided to keep that one, just in case I needed evidence later. By the third day, she escalated her tactics. I was in the driveway, setting up some shelving in the garage, when she marched over with a clipboard in hand. "You're ignoring official notices," she barked, as if she were a police officer catching me in the act. "They're not official." I replied, evenly, not even looking up from my work. "I'm not in your HOA. You have no authority here." Her lips curled back, like I'd just told her gravity didn't exist. "If you think you can just waltz into this neighborhood and defy the rules, you've got another thing coming. I've spoken to the board, and we're prepared to take legal action." I finally turned to face her, wiping my hands on a rag. "Go ahead. File whatever lawsuit you want. You'll waste your money. Because I already confirmed with the county that my property isn't part of your association. You can't fine me, you can't sue me, and you can't control what I do with my house." She sputtered, clearly not used to anyone standing their ground. "This is outrageous. You will bring down everyone's property values." At that, one of my actual neighbors, a kind man named Frank, who lived 2 houses down, wandered over. He had overheard the exchange while walking his dog and gave me a sympathetic smile before addressing her. "Karen, he's right. That house has never been part of the HOA. It's been outside the boundary since the neighborhood was built. You're wasting your time." Karen whipped her head around, glaring at him as though he'd committed treason. Frank, don't you start undermining me. You want a neighborhood full of trashy houses and peeling paint. Frank shrugged. I want a neighborhood where people mind their own business. He gave me a nod and walked on, leaving Karen fuming in the middle of my driveway. She stormed off after that, but her campaign didn't stop. Over the next week, she sent more letters, each one increasingly dramatic. One accused me of posing a danger to community cohesion. Another threatened to report me to the county. I framed that one as a joke and hung it in my garage. The real breaking point came one Saturday morning. I was planting flowers in the front yard when Karen appeared again, this time with two other HOA board members flanking her like bodyguards. One was a tall, skinny man with a permanent scowl. The other was a woman clutching a folder stuffed with papers. They marched up my driveway as though they owned the place. Mr. My last name, Karen began, her voice dripping with forced authority. This is your final warning. If you refuse to comply with HOA standards, we will file for a court order to have you removed. I couldn't help it. I burst out laughing. Removed? From my own property? That's not how it works. The skinny man stepped forward. You're disturbing the harmony of this community. By planting petunias? I asked, raising an eyebrow. You realize how ridiculous this sounds, right? The woman with the folder finally spoke up, her voice softer, almost embarrassed. Karen, maybe we should double-check the boundaries. I've heard from a few people that his house really isn't included. Karen cut her off sharply. Don't you dare take his side. That was when I pulled out my trump card. I had anticipated this nonsense from the beginning and had already contacted the county clerk's office to get official documentation. I marched into my house, grabbed the file folder from my kitchen counter, and returned to the yard. Without a word, I handed them a copy of the plat map that clearly showed my property line outside the HOA boundary. Here's the proof, I said calmly. You've been wasting everyone's time. Now, leave my property before I call the sheriff. Karen snatched the paper, scanned it quickly, and her face went pale. For a moment, she looked like she might faint. Then, just as quickly, her expression hardened again. This can't be right, she stammered. There must be some mistake. There's no mistake, I said firmly. You've been harassing me since the day I moved in, and it stops now. If you set foot on my property again, I'll file a harassment complaint. The skinny man tugged at her sleeve. Karen, let's go, he muttered, clearly uncomfortable. The other woman looked like she wanted to sink into the ground. Finally, with one last glare that could have curdled milk, Karen spun around and stomped off, her little entourage trailing behind. I watched them retreat across the street, shaking my head in disbelief. After that day, the harassment stopped, or at least slowed to a simmer. Karen still shot daggers at me whenever we crossed paths, but she never set foot on my property again. Instead, she limited her crusade to passive-aggressive glares and whispered gossip to anyone who would listen. The funny thing was, most of the neighbors seemed to take my side. They waved, offered friendly greetings, and even joked about surviving the HOA boss level. Frank invited me over for a barbecue, and others started stopping by to welcome me properly. In the end, Karen's tantrum had the opposite effect she wanted. Instead of isolating me, it made the rest of the neighborhood rally around me. And while I knew she'd probably never forgive me for existing outside her control, I had no doubt that I had stood my ground in the right way. This was my home, my sanctuary, and no self-appointed HOA dictator was ever going to scare me out of it.